We're talking to Vicky Ward. Vicky Ward Investigates, the Substack. You must subscribe to her, Vicky Ward, who is the co-author of the bestseller Idaho Four that came out last week, that she co-authored with James Patterson, talking about just a really tragic real-life story and the radicalization of men and what's been happening to young boys, especially when it comes to misogyny. We'll talk a lot about misogyny today. And also, Vicky, 20 years ago, wrote an article for Vanity Fair where the Farmer sisters, who were victims of Epstein and Ghislaine, came to her. And Vicky put their name in the story, and then she went to her editor, and it was spiked. And Epstein threatened Vicky, who at that time was pregnant with twins. And also, Vicky, then being a masochist, did the work that none of us did, is that she sat in the entire trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, who, by the way, folks, is a convicted pedophile. Just want to throw it out there. And Vicky released an audiobook called Chasing Ghislaine. And so today I wanted to invite Vicky to talk about, all the latest news about the Epstein scandal, but specifically one of the central figures behind it, Ghislaine Maxwell, because last week, a couple of days ago, I've been noticing how the right wing in particular has been trying to reframe her as a victim. Newsmax said, oh, she's a victim. And also her attorney said, oh, she's a victim of Jeffrey Epstein. And for those who haven't followed the news, Todd Blanche, who is Donald Trump's personal attorney, now Deputy Attorney General, went for 2 days and met with Ghislaine Maxwell. The meetings were shrouded in secrecy. She was given limited immunity. And voila, after those 2 days, Vicky, Ghislaine's lawyer comes out and says, well, I appeal to you, O Supreme Court and Donald Trump, to pardon my poor client. And last night, it came out that her attorney saying that Ghislaine will only speak if she's given some sort of clemency, a commutation, or a pardon. And another report came out yesterday that some people within the Trump orbit believe that Wall Street Journal got access to the diary vis-a-vis Ghislaine, who is looking for a pardon. So I want to first talk about the whole Ghislaine Maxwell part of the story, Vicky, to separate truth from nonsense. And you know her, you studied her, you've done an audiobook on her. I yield the floor to you.
Thanks, Rod. Well, where to begin? So Ghislaine Maxwell really is the reason that Jeffrey Epstein got the power and influence that he did. We don't know necessarily where all of his money came from, but the person who gave him the little black book that was his address book, now infamous, the person who connected him with Prince Andrew, with Bill Clinton, with leaders around the world and with bold-faced names, that was all Ghislaine Maxwell. So her backstory, for those of you who don't know, is that she was the youngest child of Robert Maxwell, who was, her father was an extraordinary man, been born in Czechoslovakia, came to England, where he acquired a huge amount of money and a huge amount of power. He was at one point a politician. He became a media mogul. He owned newspapers around the world. He also owned something called the Pergamon Press, a publishing. The reason my Wi-Fi is good this week, Wash.
You're back. You're back.
What happened? But the reason the Pergamon Press is important is because the Pergamon Press, owned by Robert Maxwell, on top of his newspaper groups, the Mirror Group, etc., published scientific journals. And one of the things that we also know about Maxwell, this very rich man, he was an enormous man. Physically enormous. He had a massive appetite for food, but also for women. He was a bully. He was a crook. But he was somebody who was in intelligence. He was very, very close to the Israeli government, but he also was close to the Russian government. He was close to the British government, and Um, and he used the Pergamon press. The reason it's important, and it has a bearing then on what Jeffrey Epstein later did, is that if academics, scientists put their latest cutting edge research in whatever they're working on in these academic journals. And so it's a very good way, if you're the publishing company that is publishing these academic documents, it's actually a very good way to pass important sort of almost secret information from country to country, because it's in those kind of publications that it becomes clear, what the latest work is in terms of, let's say, building a submarine or that kind of stuff. So Maxwell was someone at the apex of global power. And Ghislaine Maxwell was his favorite child, but he was a bully as a father. He was an awful man to be married to, and he was very, very notoriously tough on his children. But he named his big yacht the Lady Ghislaine, after Ghislaine Maxwell, who was his favorite child. But just so you understand, when I say favorite child, let me be clear. She once brought somebody up to her bedroom in this mansion that the family had close to Oxford. And she showed them one was a brush, one was a belt, and there was something else on her. And she said, these are the 3 instruments from which Daddy chooses when he beats me. I'm allowed to tell him which one to pick up and use. But, so her, this was a man, I tell a story in Chasing Ghislaine, how she's there with her. She brings her friends when she goes to Oxford University. She brings them home for the weekend. She's playing chess with one of them, and he comes up and he just decimates the entire chessboard. He was an absolute tyrant of a man, but she worshipped him, and he died in the early 1990s in very strange circumstances. They found his body floating on the ocean, having presumably fallen overboard. That was the official finding from his yacht. He was then given a hero's burial in Israel, in the Mount of Olives. It emerged.
Wow, in the Mount of Olives. Wow.
It emerged that he had, in fact, been stealing from his employees. He had robbed his own pension funds from the Mirror Group, which was the holding company of all his newspapers. And so, his wealth, his great wealth, was based on a house of cards. And 2 of Ghislaine's brothers, Kevin and Ian, went on trial in England after his death, accused of helping him. They were acquitted. But meanwhile, young Ghislaine, the apple of Robert Maxwell's eye, is suddenly in New York. He had just bought the Daily News newspaper in New York. And, here she is with this extraordinary Rolodex of world leaders and rich, important people around the world. But for the first time in her life, this woman, this heiress, has no money. And her father's name has been tarnished. I mean, he's now known around the world as a crook. And so it's at this point in her life that she and Jeffrey Epstein become close. And the tragedy of Ghislaine Maxwell, which, going back to something you said earlier, I would in no way equate to the tragedy of being an Epstein victim. Yeah. But her tragedy it's very different, is that a woman who had been educated to this degree, privileged to this degree, spoke languages, had multiple passports, had all these connections, did not have the self-belief to go out and start from scratch and make something of herself. And instead, she believed, and she would say this to her friends, that her father had told her that you had to rely on a man, and that once you had found a wealthy man to rely on as a woman, you must do, quote unquote, whatever it takes to keep him. And so you see then how this story is going to go. She meets Giuffre Epstein, who suddenly, in the early 1990s, and there has been speculation, always denied by the Maxwells, that, was it possible that that some of the Maxwell money found its way mysteriously? I mean, that's just been it's one of the things. It's on the conspiracy theories. I mean, did anything get funneled to Giuffre Epstein? And people ask that because Giuffre Epstein, that's a kind of thing, was involved in hiding people's money. I mean, he was open about the fact that that's what he did. Did he put any of the Maxwell money in Switzerland? He suddenly is becoming very wealthy. At the same time that he starts hanging out with Ghislaine, who needs him for his money, he suddenly, for whatever reason, seems to have a lot of it. It's in this period that he buys the huge townhouse, the biggest townhouse in New York. It's in this period he buys the island. It's in this period that he acquires the ranch in New Mexico and the apartment in Paris. And what Giuffre Epstein does not have, apart from money, he doesn't have, this is a guy who didn't have a college degree.
Right.
He doesn't have social skills. So this is where, Ghislaine Maxwell becomes invaluable to him. She can introduce him to absolutely everybody, from, Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, but she can tell him how her father used access to the world's greatest thinkers and academics and cultural leaders to his enormous strategic advantage, becoming a go-between between all these countries, Israel, Russia, Bulgaria, England. And so, it's not really just a coincidence that Giuffre Epstein, who's now being given power of attorney by Leslie Wexner, this billionaire who's got close ties to Israel, suddenly Giuffre Epstein is now using his newfound wealth from Wexner to give money to the leading academics, scientists at Harvard. And, all of that makes Giuffre Epstein appear to be philanthropic, appear to be respectable, when in fact, we also know now that in the 1990s, he uses his wealth for something completely sick and nefarious, which is to lure these young children into his home, lure them up to his massage room and give them massages. And the awful part about Ghislaine Maxwell's role in all of this is that Ghislaine Maxwell, by all accounts, had fallen madly in love with Giuffre Epstein. He replaced her father as the safe harbor figure in her life. But romantically, he was, this is a man of vast appetites. She didn't last very long, as this is not a man who was interested in marriage or monogamy, or having a conventional family life. So very quickly, he replaced Ghislaine as, his romantic interest. And the tragedy is the evil that then happens next, because in order to stay in Jeffrey Epstein's life in order to stay invaluable to him, in order to receive we know that he paid her millions and millions and millions of dollars. She begins to go out and find young girls for him. And her role in that is really critical because, particularly in the 1990s, the women who I listened to when they testified at her trial only felt safe enough to really set foot in Jeffrey Epstein's house in Palm Beach because she was there, and here is this very glamorous, sophisticated woman who appears to know everybody who's rich and famous and powerful around the world. She takes helicopter pilots. She becomes a pilot. She learns how to fly a helicopter. She seems to be so chic and glamorous. And because of her presence, these young girls start to feel safe around Jeffrey Epstein. And we also know, because this came up at her trial, that it was because she normalized sort of sexual activity with these girls around him that they began to question themselves, well, if she's okay with, me rubbing, if she's okay rubbing his feet, then should I be doing what she says and rubbing his feet? I mean, it was a whole sick manipulation. I mean, we know in the case of Annie Farmer, who is the underage victim who I talked to back in 2002 and who went on record, it was only her mother only agreed to let Annie Farmer, who was still in high school, go to visit Jeffrey Epstein at his ranch in New Mexico because Ghislaine Maxwell had assured her that she would be there. And the idea was they were going to get to know Annie Farmer better in order to then pay for a trip overseas that would help her pad out her resume in order to get into an Ivy League school. So Annie Farmer's mother only let her daughter go because she thought she would be chaperoned. And in fact, Annie Farmer back in 2002, the person who's asked for sexual advances, she talked about in the most detail were Ghislaine's.
Yeah.
She didn't get into, Jeffrey jumped into bed one morning and she froze. But Ghislaine gave her this horrendous topless massage that made her very, very uncomfortable. And she went into great detail about that. And, it's funny. Yes, I knew Ghislaine. I did not know her well, but she was, I grew up in England. She grew up in England. She's a few years older than me. But the Brits in New York tend to, it's a small world, tend to run into each other. And she was this very exotic figure who from time to time would pop up at parties, never, by the way, with Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, he would absolutely, he didn't go out. He was an enigma who stayed behind the state, confined in his own palaces, if you will. But she would appear at these parties. She talked a great deal about sex. I mean, everybody knew that. And I think she thought it was very sort of sophisticated. But you never knew exactly what she was doing with her time. She would mention that she'd just been flying a helicopter and she would mention she'd just been on the road with Bill Clinton, and you were left slightly scratching your head. I when I would run into her, she never mentioned Giuffre Epstein. So when I was very surprised, to be honest, when I was assigned to write about Giuffre Epstein. I hadn't really thought that she would be part of this story. I had not understood that. I had not understood how the whole history of that relationship, and I had not understood how closely they were connected back then. And I began to realize, because while I was reporting it, I ran into her at a baby shower. I talk about this in Chasing Ghislaine, and she sees me and starts to cry. Like, very like, what is that about? And then, of course, but I hadn't yet met the Farmer sisters. And remember, I thought this was going to be a piece about Giuffre Epstein's money.
Yeah.
I didn't know about the girls. I didn't know about the Ghislaine's role in the life. But so then,
This was around 2003 for those who were following the timeline.
Yes, the fall of 2002. But as you know, and you and I talked last time, Giuffre Epstein starts to get very, very aggressive with me, phoning me every day. What have I heard? What am I getting? And as the days go, and issuing these threats, if I don't like this piece, I'll have a witch doctor place a curse on your unborn children. Pause. And by the way, that's off the record. And, and so I then, the weeks go by and I get the two Farmer sisters, Annie Farmer, who tells me this horrendous story of this topless massage from Ghislaine. Maria Farmer also, she was not a minor when she worked for Giuffre Epstein, but she had a horrific time.
But young woman, right, Vicky? I think she was 25.
Yeah, no, she was in her 20s, and she went she went off to paint up in Ohio on a house that was on Leslie Wexner's property, and Ghislaine Maxwell and Giuffre came to visit for a weekend. And Maria Farmer was very clear that they sort of called her in to the bedroom and trapped her. And she then had a hellish time. This property was in the middle of nowhere, and trying to even leave and get out in the middle of the night sounds like it was a terrible thing. And Ghislaine was definitely at the center of that. So I then had to phone, not only did we have to go to Giuffre Epstein with these allegations, I had to phone Ghislaine Maxwell. And, I have the transcript of our conversation, because by this point, I didn't trust anybody. And the lawyers have told me to record Epstein, had record absolutely everyone, because we just didn't know who we were dealing with. And she was so belligerent about the farmers, and sort of said to me, how can you believe that, Giuffre was so kind to these young women, and how can you believe them over me? And she said to me, which I always thought it was very, and I said, well, Ghislaine, they are the record. And she said, oh, I'm a journalist as well, which was news to me, because just because they're on the record, you don't have to print the allegations. Then I said, wrongly, because as you know, they were then cut. I said, but we do. They're on the record. And so you need to come up with a response.
Yeah.
And it was this deeply, deeply, deeply difficult conversation. And I then put the phone down. And then the next thing I knew is my phone went again, just to shows you how these people operated. She phoned my then husband's boss, who's then on the phone not to my husband, but to me, saying, I've had Ghislaine Maxwell on the phone.
Wow.
Do you really have to write about her? And one of the things Jeffrey Epstein had said to me is that he would make sure that my husband got fired from his job. Now, my my husband at the time worked for his step uncle, but who knew Leslie Wexner. And this man also said to me, Vicky, do you want to be responsible for Leslie Wexner pulling all his advertising from Condé Nast, from Vanity Fair? In other words, do you singly want to be responsible for ruining the finances of this media behemoth? I mean, it was extraordinary. I mean, I was like, I was appalled and outraged. And to his credit, so was my husband, actually, that this would be going on. But it shows you how these people thought they were always one phone call away from making any of their pesky problems go away. But it was after all of this that, I then went on bed rest because I had this very high risk pregnancy. My doctor was very, very worried because he knew that I was working on something for Vanity Fair that was obviously very stressful and not good. And he said, I need you to go on bed rest. And I need you to be done with this. But it's so then I go on bed rest and I then get this email from a fact checker saying Jeffrey Epstein is here in the offices.
Right.
And I'm, what? And then it was after that the Farmer sisters got, I then got sent the final, what they call galley. That is how the piece will appear in the magazine. And suddenly the sisters and their allegations have been removed. I was told it would be better just as a business piece. I was not told, well, it's because we didn't think legally, we could include it. I was told it was because it reads better as a business piece. And then as I then was then looking at the Wall Street Journal, its reports in the last month, when they they talked about this correspondence that was sent to Jeffrey Epstein for his 50th birthday. So that was while all this was happening. That was January 2003, and there's all this hilarity from them amongst these guys about this very Vanity Fair piece. So you can imagine how I felt reading that journal piece. That all of this was just a joke amongst all of them. So there you have it. I mean, what I explain in Chasing Ghislaine is that Ghislaine Maxwell, around 2004 or so, which interestingly is around the same time Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein supposedly fell out, she tries to move on from him. She gets a billionaire boyfriend, a guy called Ted Waite, who is a sort of tech entrepreneur. And so around the time that Jeffrey Epstein was going through the first plea deal, when he switched out the federal charges against him and instead pled guilty to 2 state charges and went for his cushy 13 months jail sentence, Ghislaine Maxwell was actually trying to move on with her life and get away from him. But the problem for her really surfaced with Virginia Giuffre.
Yep.
Because Virginia Giuffre had, again, I in the fall of 2002, which is when I was reporting my Vanity Fair piece and going through this nightmare with Jeffrey Epstein, unbeknownst to me, I mean, I'd never heard of the name Virginia, but that was the exact moment in time when Virginia did a runner. They sent her off to Thailand to, do some massage course. And instead of coming back, she meets the man she marries and never comes back to the States. She then goes, they marry, and they go and live in Australia. So Virginia was not part of the was not, as far as I understand it, interviewed by the FBI as part of the original all the girls who came forward in Florida in the 2000s. But when Jeffrey Epstein did that plea deal with Alex Acosta, it turned out it was illegal. What happened was illegal because none of the victims were notified that he was doing this plea deal. And so they all banded together and formed a class action lawsuit. And Virginia wound up, and Virginia had, you remember, had this photograph of herself with Prince Andrew with his arm around her waist, and Ghislaine Maxwell, supposedly taken by Jeffrey Epstein. And so partly because that photograph was so powerful in what it said, and she was 17 at the time, and because she then joined in late 2014 the victims' lawsuit, and she was very vocal. Not only did she have this photograph of Prince Andrew, she was vocal about the fact that Epstein had pimped her out to...
I think the word she used was, they passed me around like candy.
There you go. Right.
Go.
And that's really, that it's a very, very important moment. It really is, because what happens is that Ghislaine Maxwell accuses her publicly of being a liar. And so Virginia turns around and sues Ghislaine Maxwell. And the reason that this is so important, this moment in the story, is because of, this all tragedy, is that although that lawsuit ultimately gets settled, everything in it, that what Virginia says, Ghislaine pushing back, that becomes the basis. The discovery in it becomes the basis of the charges against Jeffrey Epstein, the federal charges in 2019, and then subsequently the charges against Ghislaine. That becomes the backbone, and it's confusing, even though Virginia Roberts was not called to testify at Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. And I can explain, it's that there are legal reasons for that. When you've already had a civil case with somebody, lawyers tend to not want to go back down that road. In a criminal case, they tend to want to bring in different new voices that haven't been litigated over and over again in the past.
And can I say, with I didn't mean to cut you off, but with with Virginia Giuffre, folks, and the latest news, there's so much news that comes out. When Donald Trump was asked by reporters, well, what did you mean that you had a falling out with Jeffrey Epstein when he poached, your workers? He was referring to Virginia Giuffre, who was a 16-year-old spa attendant at Mar-a-Lago because her father worked at Mar-a-Lago, and she was a Virginia girl working as a spa attendant, was reading a book on massages. And Ghislaine, who was there, approached her, stalked her, groomed her, lured her away from Mar-a-Lago, and said, "Oh, I work with Jeffrey, and don't worry, you don't have to be a professional, and this will be great for you." And then the person who Donald Trump said he stole her from me, stole her. He's talking about Virginia Giuffre, one of the most notable victims, who, without her, it seems that Ghislaine and Jeffrey would not be in jail.
100% correct. 100% correct. And it's sort of amazing, given that she did work at the spa at Mar-a-Lago, and that moment, it was so pivotal in everything that has subsequently happened. The moment that Ghislaine Maxwell came in and grabbed her, and and it's true, that Virginia Giuffre never went back to Mar-a-Lago. Ghislaine said, "Come with me," and that was that. Virginia started a new terrible existence in the house of Jeffrey Epstein, and so it was actually kind of extraordinary that Donald Trump never addressed this until now. I mean, because as you say, Virginia Roberts' father, Sky Roberts, worked for Trump for a long, I think over 20 years at Mar-a-Lago. And what also I thought was interesting, he talked about employees. So I wondered, well, who else? He said that that Epstein came back a second time, and tried to take someone else, and I wondered who that was. But it's also a bit different from what he supposedly, I mean, I've reported this, said to his own campaign advisor back in 2014 when Virginia first surfaced in the news, joining the victims' lawsuit I've told you about, and when the photograph of her with Prince Andrew. Because what Trump supposedly then said was, when it all surfaced, was, Epstein and I fell out because he was hitting on a member's daughter at Mar-a-Lago. So that's not the same thing, right, as stealing your quote unquote employees. So,
I mean, there's a lot of,
other than the plot thickens, right?
Absolutely. Like, what do you mean by steal? And then also, the reason why the plot thickens for me, Vicky, especially because Trump, thank God, cannot shut the F up, self-incriminates himself, is the previous story was, oh yeah, we had a falling out in 2004 due to a real estate deal. And then now you realize, because it was twice, folks, back to back. Donald Trump said it on his own when he was talking to Keir Starmer. He took workers from me. And then the next day, which was yesterday, when reporters asked him, he went into detail and he said he stole Virginia Giuffre, a 16-year-old girl, from me. So it wasn't the property deal. It wasn't him being a convicted pedophile. It wasn't him being allegedly in a sex trafficking ring. Oh no, Vicky. It was because he stole Virginia Giuffre, who was a 6-year-old spa attendant, who later then becomes the most notable victim, precisely because of what you said, because the photo that comes out with Prince Andrew, which then becomes the basis, the information then becomes the basis of the conviction. And so this is a man who, Vicky, you would think, you're the president of the United States, just lie. Read a printed statement, right, Vicky? But the cruelty and the misogyny is so ingrained in Trump that even as this is escalating around him, he still can't let go of this grievance that Epstein stole Virginia Giuffre from him. I mean, just remarkable to me.
Right. And obviously, no consideration of the fact that poor Virginia Giuffre, after fighting for so many years, very sadly died earlier this year.
April,
supposedly committed suicide. I will say, I obviously met Virginia and interviewed her, and I mean, years of, I mean, when she came forward in 2014, one wonders if she knew, really what the difficulty of what lay ahead, and yes, when you take on Prince Andrew, and you take on the plutocracy effectively, it takes a toll.
Her father says, and Virginia Giuffre, folks, died in Australia, they say by suicide, just a few months ago, April. But her father believes there was foul play. Obviously, we don't know, but since you met her and talked to her, there were some individuals who said that she was not suicidal. Obviously, she had to endure so much trauma. Your take on this, the father's contention that he doesn't believe that it was suicide, that there possibly could be foul play.
Well, look, I mean, she was going through a horrific divorce, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, one of the reasons she always said that one of the reasons she decided to come out and be so public was for her children. And I believe that her children had been mandated by the courts to be with her estranged husband. And so I think that knowing that her children, how important her children were to her, that is a very sad element of all of this. The other stress on Virginia goes again to how dark this story around Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell really is, because wasn't part of their very twisted, manipulative scheme. It was, yes, Ghislaine Maxwell was sort of like the mother figure at the top, luring these girls in, normalizing all this, sick underage abuse. But Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein created this pyramid scheme whereby then they paid Virginia to go out and recruit other vulnerable teenagers, sort of persuading them that, they were doing this for money. And that came up at Ghislaine Maxwell's trial, that one of them, another woman, Carolyn and Andriano, who sadly subsequently also committed suicide, came out and pointed a finger at Ghislaine Maxwell, yes, but also at Virginia. And so this is why this story is so complicated and dark, because you have women, grooming
Yep.
women, grooming children. I mean, it's that is one of the difficulties. And Virginia was facing, there was another survivor who they were in a legal battle, that, as far as I know, actually still hasn't been resolved. So there are complications. I mean, this story is, people, I think, want it to be neat, tied up with a bow, but it isn't.
The rot starts from the top, and I just want people to know. And I appreciate that. That's why Vicky's one of the best guests. All you got to do is press play on Vicky, and she tells you a story. It's an interviewer's dream, and Vicky's done the work for 2 decades on this. But I just want people to remind people the rot starts from the top. Epstein and Ghislaine, right? And Ghislaine not only groomed these women, she stalked them. According to your reporting with the Farmer Sisters, she molested them, she groomed them, and then she ran cover for Jeffrey Epstein. And she used her wealth, her sophistication, her money, her contacts to get Jeffrey Epstein in these echelons of power, where he was then able to pass around girls, folks, like Virginia and others like Candy, and then in turn groom and radicalize them to go get other women. It's so sick, and there's so many powerful men who have not been held accountable, such as Donald Trump, because all the evidence is there, folks. For 2 decades, he's been partying with Epstein since the late '80s. Even in 2002, after the alleged fallout over Virginia Giuffre, that he stole her. Those are Trump words. Donald Trump still praised Jeffrey. Oh, I partied with him. He's a great guy, even though he likes the girls a bit young. The fact that they mocked Vicky in that birthday book that Ghislaine compiled for Epstein, that now the Wall Street Journal is talking about, the fact that Pam Bondi apparently told Trump that he was in this evidence in May. That means for the past 2 months they've been engaged in a cover-up. So it's drip, drip, drip. And the last question I want to ask you before I talk to you about the Idaho Four, another case of misogyny and treating women like property that results in violence and death. What do you think is Glenn's end game here? Because it seems very clear to me that she has some goods, but she's not willing to give them up unless she gets the pardon. And Donald Trump, folks, has not ruled out pardoning Glenn, which I think is very fascinating. Vicky.
Well, I mean, I think it's really clear, right? I mean, her line the whole way through this has been she got an unfair trial. There were problems with the juror. That she's protected this plea deal that Jeffrey Epstein did back in the infamous one in 2008. So there was a non-prosecution agreement signed where the government said they wouldn't come after, and then there are 4 names. Now, Ghislaine Maxwell is not one of those names, but her legal team have always contended she was covered by that agreement. So, they have got a lawsuit going that's pending before the Supreme Court. So, listen, she has nothing to lose and everything to gain.
Absolutely.
And we know because the very last time Trump, before all of this reared its head, right back when she was on trial, Donald Trump rather famously said, "I wish her well." So, which, not a sentiment that was echoed by the rest of the country. But so, of course, her lawyers are insisting, one, that anything she says to Congress would be, she would be given immunity, and that otherwise she'll just plead the fifth if they don't do that. And of course, they're looking for a quid pro quo. Of course, they want pardon her sentence, her sentence to be commuted. I mean, I would think if you were Trump trying to think about this politically, or they could send her out of the country, possibly. And once she's out of America, who knows what a different government would do. And so, I mean, it's, and then there's talk of 100 names that she gave Todd Blanche in those 2 days of interviews. I mean, if you're Trump, I mean, this is now in the realm of speculation because I'm not Trump, but you've got to be asking to see who those names are and figuring out which of them, if any, are big enough. Who's going to take the fall. Yep. And so one of them is, it's not going to be Donald Trump. Who's going to take the fall so he can then turn around and tell his base and all the people who want answers, which actually not just his base. I mean, I think most of us do want answers, but he's then got to figure out how to justify, if he does a deal with Ghislaine Maxwell, how the hell he's going to justify that to all the victims. And I think to other people who would think that makes a mockery of the US justice system. And so who I think now really the right question to ask is who is going to take the fall, so that Trump can explain why he's going to either commute Ghislaine Maxwell's sentence or give her a pardon in order to get this information.
Thankfully, you and me are not Donald Trump, but if I'm Donald Trump and I know how he thinks, what I would say is, Ghislaine, you give me 3 notable Democrats and liberals, starting with Bill Clinton, and you tell everyone I was not involved and I never went to the island. And if you do that, well, I just might give you a commutation. But this is where I think there's some good news. Like you said, Vicky, a poll came out that about 89% of Americans are following this case. Donald is negative double digits on the Epstein scandal. His own base is turning on them. I believe, and he might do this, folks. I do not put it past him because he's desperate. He's in the files. If he does commute and or pardon Ghislaine or helps her out, it will not make his troubles go away. The base is too radicalized. This story is too saturated now with the public. People want the whole files. And I feel like in a strange way, the victims who have suffered for so long might finally be the kryptonite for Teflon Don and bring him down. And thanks to you and your reporting. Folks, I have 10 minutes left with Vicky. I take up too much of her time, but she's a great guest. And I promised her last time, and also for my own edification, she has a best-selling book out right now. So in addition to this, folks, she has a best-selling book that just got published last week. 2 weeks ago with James Patterson, where she talks about a nonfiction story, a chilling story about misogyny and violence that leads to real life murder. The Idaho Four, and in an American tragedy, and the reason why I want to talk about this, in addition to give Vicky a good plug, but because it's so connected, is what we're seeing now is social media and the radicalization of young men in real time and the dehumanization of women, and this type of toxic masculinity that very deliberately MAGA and the Trump movement has jumped on, and the type of devastating consequences this is having on American families and communities. And so, Vicky, if you can, give us a teaser so people do buy the book about this real life story that happened in Idaho and why it's so relevant to all these themes that we're witnessing with Donald Trump, with MAGA, with social media, and the dehumanization of women.
Yeah, well, thank you, Raj, because it is. This is not just a book about four awful murders that happened in the middle of the night. It is a much broader book that really does paint a picture of America now. So beginning, I think, with the portrait of the killer who whose parents definitely felt was, he was on the spectrum, was not supported particularly by the school system, was overlooked with all his sort of social difficulties, and unquestionably, you know, was vulnerable to the toxic masculinity culture that is all pervasive on the internet. And when you have these young guys who don't really have any physical friends or relationships, all they know is what they get to online. And here you had a guy who we do know was absolutely very familiar with what they call the incel culture, the involuntary celibate movement that really has gathered a huge amount of popularity in the last decade, amongst young men whose interactions with women are now, just a swipe one way or the other. They're used to being rejected online rather than in person. We know that by the time the killer got to Washington State University to study a PhD in criminology, his treatment of women was so heinous that it basically blew up his career. He was about to lose the funding because of creepy behavior, following women to car, telling classmates that he could walk into any social gathering and have any woman he wanted, that women belonged in the kitchen and the bedroom. They had no business, being on campus. We also know that because he was a criminology PhD, he had studied, whilst doing his master's, he'd studied the mindsets of various mass killers, serial killers, and spree killers. But one guy in particular, there are a lot of parallels between what happened in Idaho and what happened back in Santa Barbara in 2014 with another incel guy who sort of becomes like a cult hero of the incel movement, a guy called Elliot Rodger. Similar situation. Elliot Rodger was a college student, similar in that there were two college towns near each other, Isla Vista and Santa Barbara. Similar in that Elliot Rodger wrote about his particular hatred of sorority girls, but in particular a childhood friend of his called Maddie, who was blonde. One of the victims that Brian Koberger killed was called Maddie Mogan. Elliot Rodger wrote a whole journal about his life, and he made a series of videos sitting in his BMW outlining his plans for retribution against these women who had rejected him. And he said he was going to go out and kill them all, and sent this video to his therapist, who sent it to his mother minutes before he went out and did just that. So in the book, so we know, there just are these parallels. It's also true, and we explain this in the book, that, the victims, as you know, were typical young college students. They had public social media accounts, as did their friends, because, if young, attractive women, understandably, they hoped, well, perhaps they could become, they could make their living becoming influencers. Never occurred to them that they could be somebody looking at their social media with horrific motives. And what we also get into in the book is how this the online culture became a very dark thing for the friends of the victims, including the friends who even had to suffer the shock and trauma of finding the bodies, because they then, in the middle of dealing with that and the fear that whoever did this might be them coming for them, they then got accused online of being the killer.
Wow.
And you see that, and the police chief, who I got to know very, very well, it became a huge problem for him, in that, he's been trained, he knows how to conduct a murder investigation, even a murder of 4 kids all in the same house at one time. But what he didn't have training in was how to deal with this bombardment. And what ended up happening was that the police had to waste a lot of time then publicly clearing people who'd got nothing to do with this crime. So that was incredibly unhelpful. And what was also very unhelpful was that, the way our justice system works means that the victims' families, unfortunately, have to be kept in the dark by prosecutors and by law enforcement. And so they are then left helpless as all these speculations and fake things about their children get talked about. And they are a little stuck as to how to try to correct the narrative. They've just lost, their child's just been murdered, and now there's all this crap out there, and they're feeling like they've got their hands tied behind their back. It's a really bad situation.
The story, unfortunately, what you just said reminds me of a tragedy that I just wrote about yesterday. Is that after 9/11, Salman Hamdani was a 9/11 first responder who walked into the towers as it was burning to save people. And this country then called him a potential terrorist, as his mother and family were desperately searching for his body. And then 45 days later, they're like, oops, sorry, he's actually a hero. So just think about the legacy, the narrative, the parents. And this is the tragedy. I think the through line of these conversations is the compounding tragedies, right? How the web
Yes.
of victimhood spreads generation to generation. And it's not just limited to one girl or one victim, right? It's the parents, it's the community. And to see how people who you can easily say are, oh, evil, no one's born evil, right? People are in a way radicalized and then do evil things. Even people like Ghislaine, even people like this incel, who was radicalized in part by his own frustration and then online in these toxic narratives. And you see another through line, misogyny and the dehumanization of women and not listening to women and not trusting women and not believing women and not uplifting women. And you see the president of the United States yesterday referring to a woman who died, as we know, by suicide, a victim, one of the most notable victims of Epstein and Maxwell, Virginia Giuffre, who was poached, stalked, groomed, abused, uh, from the age of 16 onward. And he called her, he stole her. He talked to her like she was property. This type of mindset, folks, is poison. It's a type of mindset where I said earlier, the rot comes from the top. The top right now is Donald Trump, commander in chief. And what does it say, Vicky, about a country who a majority of voters decided that this is the representation that we want to send to the rest of the world? This is our best of the best. A man who grabs women by the pee. A man who's been held liable for sexually assaulting a woman, E. Jean Carroll. A man who, traffics in these alpha men and these men who talk about men being men, right? A man who government allowed Andrew Tate to come here from Romania, right? You all remember that? I keep the receipts. Andrew Tate was able to leave house arrest because of a deal that was made with the Trump administration. So thank you, Vicky, for doing the work. Thank you for doing the legwork. Thanks for coming on again. And like I said before, Vicky is a great guest. You just press play on her, and she tells you a story, right? It's a host's dream. Vicky, before we let you go, please shamelessly promote yourself.
So, well, I have a Substack, Vicky Ward Investigates. You can read the Idaho Four. You can listen to
Show the book cover again. Show the book cover again.
The book cover.
There
again,
you go.
With James Patterson. You can listen to Chasing Ghislaine on Audible or watch it on Discovery Plus. And we've got a new announcement coming that I'll hold my fire. Next time we talk, I'll tell you what we're doing next. But we're about to announce the next book. That's exciting too.
Ooh, when do you make that announcement?
Very shortly. I'll ping you. You're going to be interested, I think.
We'll shamelessly promote that idea and we'll celebrate it. And once you announce it, we'll have you back on. Folks, we've been talking for an hour. There's about almost 1,200 of you watching. Don't worry, the whole conversation will be up on my Substack and Vicky's Substack later today. I strongly recommend you listen because Vicky's done the work tracing Glenn's entire life. How she met Epstein, why she did what she did, how she was caught, and the type of damage, that she has, the wreckage she has left behind with Jeffrey Epstein and the victims. And also, we talked about Idaho Four, a book that Vicky co-wrote with James Patterson that was released about 2 weeks ago, which is a bestseller, which again is another tragedy, a real life tragedy about a man who was radicalized in part online. And the through line is the hatred of women, treating women like property, and a real life murders, folks, which has shocked and still continues to shock not just the nation, but those communities and those families. Vicky, thanks so much. Thank you all for watching. I'll be back later at 3 p.m. with my co-host Danielle Moody for news of the day. And also, I'll be back at 2 p.m. With a reporter who will talk to us about painful news. Emile Beauvais, one of the worst, is now a friggin' lifetime judge thanks to Republican Senators 50-49. It didn't have to be this way, folks, because there was another judge who was nominated by Biden. His name was Justice Manji, extremely brilliant, talented man, 45 years old. But thanks to 3 Democratic senators, they fell prey to bad faith racist smearing of Justice Manji. Didn't vote for him. There was a vacancy. And now we have Emile Beauvais. It's literally the worst timeline on earth, Vicky. Vicky will be back hopefully soon when she will have some tasty, tasty news about a new project. I'll see you all in an hour. But until then, be kind, be empathetic, and please, oh, please don't be a fascist. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.